You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 7th of June, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The shortest day, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak slights them on the beaches. The citizens of the European Union go to the polls with varying enthusiasm, and Paris hunkers tighter into the brace position ahead of the Olympics. But should it relax about the prospect? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. It's Friday, so it's our weekly in-house daily, and the Monocle staffers who tripped first in this afternoon's sack race were Carlotta Rebello, Chris Chermak, Claudia Jacobs, Amy van den Berg and Fernando Augusto Pacheco. They will discuss the day's big stories, and we will also have a letter from Delphi. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I'm joined first of all by Monocle's senior foreign correspondent Carlotta Rebello and by Monocle's senior news editor Chris Chermak. Hello to you both.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm apparently the junior partner at this table.
Well, you didn't give your title as part of this, did
Well,
you?
yeah, I know,
so
but
you
I'm
always give everyone else's title and not your own.
But I'm not senior anything.
Is this the start of a campaign for you to become senior contributing editor?
That'd be great, wouldn't it? Senior contributing editor.
Careful what you wish for. Does one always want the senior title?
Well, I don't know. You guys tell me. You have the senior title. Has it enhanced your lives in any respect?
Well, it puts me here on a Friday at 6 o'clock, so you take your own conclusions.
This is the role of the seniors. Yes, absolutely.
Well,
how excited we are to have lost that sack race.
Okay, well, that's the kind of energy I like to hear at the top of the show. We're going to start with the latest and most spectacular of several self-inflicted wounds administered during this election campaign by UK Prime Minister, as of this broadcast, Rishi Sunak, who you would reckon would be running out of feet to shoot himself in and bullets with which to do it. But Sunak has spent today attempting to atone for yesterday's baffling decision to bail early on the 80th anniversary D-Day observances in order to return to the UK to film an interview which won't be broadcast until next week anyway, and which would improve his electoral prospects not even slightly. Chris, I'm going to throw this one to you because I am at a total loss. How in the wide world of sports does this happen?
Well, I mean, I'm somewhat at a loss as well, but what I find most interesting personally about this is that as much as it has been sold now as clearly this idea that he had to get back for the elections that are happening here and he just, couldn't stop campaigning despite how far behind he is, it does seem like this was a decision that was taken 7, 8, 9 weeks ago. The BBC had some comment from the French authorities from around that time, 8 weeks ago, saying that the UK would be participating in their own event on D-Day, and Sunak was not necessarily expected for the international portion of the event, and that in itself kind of boggled my mind reading that. Aside from all the election stuff, that was sort of what the Americans typically do, right? We're the ones who are sort of, we'll do our own stuff. We don't want to hang out with you guys. Joe Biden flitzes in and then flitzes out again. But in this case, it's D-Day. Everybody stays. But for some reason, this was a pre-planned thing, even before this election was announced, that Rishi Sunak and his people, his entourage, were like, I'm not sure we need to be there for the photos with Macron, Olaf Scholz and Joe Biden. What do we need that for?
I think it gets even worse than that, because it has also emerged, I think the Telegraph was reporting on this today, that according to the same documents or source that the BBC had access, Sunak attending the British part of the event was a compromise, because the plan was that he wasn't going to attend at all. And then it got pointed out that he had to be present. And just this idea that a prime minister, whether it's a Conservative or a Labour or whoever, a British prime minister wouldn't take part in such celebrations, that idea would even cross anyone's mind, is absolutely mind-boggling.
Well,
and the fact that this has been the compromise is even worse. I think it makes it even worse.
I mean, there's two levels, I think, of bewilderment to as far as most people are concerned here, Carlotta. I mean, it's one of those things that looks bad and is bad. I mean, there is the obvious gesture of disrespect to the event and to the very few surviving veterans who are actually attending it, none of whom, for obvious reasons, will be in attendance next time a big anniversary of D-Day is commemorated. And it is just the absolute... And it's not the first time we've seen this from Sunak, but the astonishing political boneheadedness of it, given that the only people he can pitch to are the over-60s generation, the people who were raised on World War II movies, who look back upon something like June the 6th as a great shining moment, and quite rightly. He is somebody who's gone into this election campaign advocating national service, and he can't even stick around at a military event for the afternoon.
Well, and I feel like that's going to be a point that's going to be coming up over and over again after what he did. And you're taking a slight step back when we look at how the election even was announced, him making that speech outside Downing Street in the pouring rain. That was already something that if you saw in a movie or a TV show, you would say, that's too far-fetched. That would never happen. The scriptwriters have gotten out of hand. What happened yesterday, this decision and a subsequent apology that just made it even worse, because as Chris pointed out, doesn't even make sense. The facts don't even add up. Like, you're coming back for an interview, but you didn't know that the interview would be there because of D-Day, but then it's it doesn't make any sense, the timeline. You just wouldn't believe it. You just wouldn't believe if someone put this in a fiction. You would say that is too far-fetched to ever happen. Yet he continues to prove us wrong. And we still have weeks of election ahead of us. And I feel like this is not the end of it.
One more point on top of that as well that boggles the mind for me is the fact that if you have an event like this in an election, surely also these are the moments where you appear like a leader. This is the moment, this
Absolutely.
is exactly the photo opportunity that you would have thought, even if they weren't planning for this initially, they would have said, oh, this is perfect. Right in the middle of an election, we're going to get the picture with Macron, with Biden, with Scholz, all looking presidential, leadership-like on the beaches of Normandy. I mean, that is the perfect photo op for a world leader to show I'm the serious guy and don't trust those labor people. They don't know necessarily what they're doing. That's part of his pitch, isn't it? He's stable. He's the leader in this scenario. So why did he not stay for that photograph?
Absolutely. And you're already seeing the effects that has had in the world stage. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who was also present.
And he has a fair bit on.
He's quite busy, with a bit more than an election. He released, the official video on the presidency's social media channels from a recap of D-Day celebrations. Of course, pictured with Olaf Scholz, with Macron, with Biden. Sunak doesn't appear, but you know who appears greeting him? Keir Starmer.
Yes, Keir Starmer stayed
that's
till
all
the end.
You need to know.
I mean, it has been a masterclass from Rishi Sunak. It really has. And as Carlotta correctly points out, we have a few more weeks to go, during which you really couldn't rule out at this point Rishi Sunak being filmed stuffing a pensioner into a wheelie bin. So we will move on to something else, which is the EU elections. And across Europe, votes are being cast in Earth's second biggest democratic endeavour, which are elections to the European Parliament. Some numbers are already in. Exit polls in the Netherlands suggest that though the far-right seethers of the Freedom Party have enjoyed their anticipated bump, it will be tight between them and an alliance of leftward and or Green parties. Chris, I know all European countries are massively different, but there had been this idea that there would be a big surge for far-right weirdos across Europe. Can we glean anything from the Dutch exit polls?
Well, that little bit that, yes, it is a little bit more mixed. One thing we can glean also is that there was actual interest. There was a record number of people turning out in the Netherlands, albeit still just below 50%. The European elections typically don't generate a huge amount of turnout, but there is some more interest that I think we've seen in different parts of Europe, not only in the Netherlands, but, I've been working on a series of reports and packages with our correspondents that we ran on the briefing, and it was interesting hearing from them how there is actually interest in places like the Baltics, for example, the Nordic countries as well. There is actually a new interest in the European Union, I think, partly because of course, Ukraine and what that represents for Europe. So you're seeing a certain amount of passion, I think, in this election, which is quite rare when it comes to the European parliament. And to the point about the far right, yes, I think we can glean that it's gone in kind of interesting mixed directions. I think one could definitely make too much of the far right's gains. Also because what's been interesting is the fight within the Conservatives, right? You've seen the sort of supposed far right, say the Giorgia Meloni's of Italy, kind of moving to the centre and sort of creating their own sort of not quite as far right bloc who are maybe willing to work with the other Conservatives. And then you've seen the far right parties as well. So there's been this kind of mix infighting between them. So exactly which far right is going to win is getting kind of increasingly complicated in this election.
I want to focus in on one particular European country, Carlotta, and seeing as how you're sitting here, why not Portugal? How big a whoop is this European election back where you come from?
It is quite big. And in fact, Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president, was yesterday in Porto campaigning with the Prime Minister, the Portuguese Prime Minister, and the head of the AD, the Aliança Democrática, which won the elections, the head the main candidate for these European elections. And they took part in a rally throughout the streets. And the fact that she chose Portugal to go to shows you just how significant this is. You know, we have a centre-right government in Portugal after nearly a decade of the socialists being in power. So this really is, and the election happened this year. So this really is, you know, a test to see where Portugal is actually leaning towards to, and where exactly this conversation about whether these fringe parties, both on the left and on the right, will be emboldened by the European elections. One thing that I found quite interesting when looking at the initial analysis coming out of not only the Dutch vote, but the election campaign up until now, is the EPP, the big European parliamentary group, has been slowly expanding. And that is the case in Portugal, that Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the EPP. That's why she was there. It's been doing quite a good job in attracting these smaller parties from countries around Europe to bringing them into their fold. So in a weird way, the group has expanded, and that could dictate its success in these European elections.
A thought as well before we move off this subject, Chris, on Germany. Obviously an amount of nervousness at large in Germany about whether the AfD might make a significant dent in this election. This is despite their Sunak-esque pre-election mishap when the leader of the AfD chose the moment of an actual election campaign to suggest that maybe the SS weren't all bad.
Yeah, the leader of the European election part of it, which is Maximilian Krah. But yes, I think what's interesting, if you want to make that comparison, is the fact that the AfD, despite doing everything they can to lose this election, including having various officials arrested for spying for the Chinese and for the Russians, not even just one, but both.
Okay, Sunak hasn't done that, but we are still 4 weeks out.
He hasn't done
There's still time.
yet, there's time. And these comments about the SS as well from Maximilian Krah, and yet they seem to just have this stable level of support. It should be said, I think, that again, to the point of like not making too much of the far right in various countries, it's possible the AfD will become the second largest party in Germany, but that is also only because all of the other parties are doing so poorly, except for the Christian Democratic Union of Angela Merkel previously. The SPD of Olaf Scholz is on 15%. The Greens are on 15%. The Free Democrats are on 5%. So the entire coalition government of Germany right now is kind of in tatters. They're arguing amongst each other. Scholz hasn't proved a very strong leader. So the AfD, they're all kind of stuck in that 15% range. So in that sense, it's not as if the far right has made a tremendous gain in Germany. But that said, given all of these scandals that they've had, it's quite amazing that they are still at 15%.
I do just want to add one more question on turnout, Carlotta, which is usually miserable for European elections. It was barely over 50% last time, and that was actually quite an improvement on the previous couple of European elections. Does it strike you, whether in Portugal or generally, that the EU has done a good enough job yet of getting people to buy into it and explaining to people why it actually matters?
Well, I'm not sure about, whether it's been the EU that's been doing a good job, but I'm really glad you asked that question, because turnout in these elections has always been an issue. But the fact that the issue surrounding Israel's war in Gaza and the recognition or not of Palestine as a state has been such a key issue in this election that actually some pollsters around the continent have predicted that will have an impact in turnout, because these are issues that voters care deeply about. One of the examples that I believe was Euronews that was reporting on today was the example of Slovenia, where in the past 2019 elections had one of the lowest turnout amongst the EU, and this year is expected to reach 40%, which for these elections is quite high. The last time we saw a spike was in voter turnout was because the green agenda was becoming a thing, and voters were deeply passionate about that. So when you have, the war in Ukraine, the question of Ukraine membership on the table, the war in Gaza as key issues, and where countries and these alliances within the European Parliament will stand on that issue, I think this is what is going to bring voters out more than the policies that have always been in place and that will affect their day-to-day lives. So this is, I feel like, topics that we should watch for, and perhaps will bring more people to vote out over the next 3 days.
Carlotta Rebello and Chris Chomak, thank you both for joining us. You are listening to The Daily.
The June issue of Monocle magazine features our annual art special. Is Carthage cool again? We take a look at the emerging art scene in Tunis, while in Norway we go down and under in a grain silo turned museum. Discover all this in the latest issue of Monocle. Pick up a copy at your favourite newsstand or subscribe today at monocle.com/subscribe.
You are listening to the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined now by Monocle magazine researcher Claudia Jacob, by Monocle's deputy books editor Amy Vandenberg, and by Monocle Radio's senior culture correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Hello to all of you.
Hello.
There will now be a brief silence from the rest of you while I read out the introduction to the next item. It is 7 weeks from today that the 2024 Olympics will open in Paris, and as has become traditional when the Olympics are held in places where the local citizens are permitted to express an opinion, the opinions expressed by these local citizens, a restive and or grumpy bunch at the best of times, have tended towards the negative, specifically forebodings that nothing will work, that the security arrangements will be a massive pest, and that Paris in July will be even more overrun by pestilential foreigners than usual. There are those who insist, however, that almost despite itself, France is undergoing something of an Olympics-related cultural revival. Amy, first of all, you edited Monocle's great big book about France. So, are we seeing any kind of Olympics bounce in France?
I think a lot of things are happening in France, especially in Paris, obviously. And I think the whole vibe of the city that I've noticed has kind of welcomed the Olympics coming. I think it's been very exciting.
Paris welcoming things.
Yeah, I know. It's very...
That's going to be interesting. Claudia, what are you seeing in terms of how this is already changing Paris? Because it is a thing that's always a source of contention before and after a games. Is there going to be a legacy? Is there a legacy? Does this legacy actually mean anything, etc.? What is Paris trying to leave behind?
Yeah, I think it's this funny paradox as we're sort of approaching, actually getting as close as we've ever been to the Olympics actually happening. People are actually starting to think post-Olympics, which is quite a funny paradox. But there's been lots of stuff in the press about how the Olympic Village is going to be used after the Games, about how the village has been purpose-built to actually be accommodation post-Games, as opposed to other games where they've actually had to repurpose it because it wasn't the original idea. And some thoughts about how the Seine might be incorporated better into our lives. They've talked a lot about cleaning it up, but there's also talk about whether we can start using these boats as a means of public transport. So not just as a tourist trap, as some might say. The bateau mouche is like a typical boat trip that you can do along the Seine, but actually maybe we can follow the example of other cities and start to integrate it into our daily lives.
And to bring you in, Fernando, does Paris make the very long list of things about which you are terrifically enthusiastic?
Yes, I love Paris. And to be honest, I was not even supposed to be here because I'm the guy who's going to talk about the next story. But I said, It's France. I love it. Paris is one of my favorite cities. I breathe, French culture. I listen to French music all the time. You might have noticed that on Monocle Radio, I would say 25% of all our songs are from French artists. So it is a big deal. And I love it.
That's more than French radio stations play, and they have to play a certain amount by law. No one's making you, Fernando.
But you were talking about Renaissance here. I mean, if you look at the French chart, there's so many young artists, hip-hop artists, pop, electro. It's very exciting. I mean, honestly, I always take some inspiration when I look at their charts.
Amy, when you edited our big book about France and thinking about Paris in particular, it is obviously one of the most examined, discussed, chronicled cities on earth, and quite rightly, all jokes aside, Fernando, I'm broadly with you where Paris is concerned, though I do wish people wouldn't ride motor scooters on the footpath. But Amy, did anything new about Paris occur to you? Did we come up with any exciting new angles on this much discussed city?
Yeah, there's a long history, obviously, of cafe terrace culture in Paris. And there's a ton of really great, new places coming up, a lot of entrepreneurs coming to Paris. And then, there's exciting areas. Le Marais, we spent a lot of time in when we were visiting Paris. And there's just a lot of, a lot of young people in different areas and starting a lot of good new restaurants and cafes and stuff like that. Yeah, there's a good vibe overall, yeah.
And Claudia, in introducing this item, I did suggest or did allude to quite well-sourced reports that the people of Paris are not terrifically enthused about the prospect of the Olympics, which I think is quite common. It was the same here in 2012, and then once they were up and running, everybody suddenly decided, oh, this is great. But do you think that is true of Paris? Do you think people are grouching about it, or are they just grouching about it because they understand that that's what we're supposed to do because we're Parisians and secretly they're actually quite looking forward to it?
I'm going to give an anecdote that I told Faye at lunch. He's already laughing at me. But I was in Paris last week and someone, and I quote, said she would rather drink bleach than be in the city during the Olympic Games.
Okay, so we'll put her down as an undecided.
So I think that summarises the general sense of what's going on. Having said that, I did speak to a fair few journalists of different publications based in Paris for our Paris newspaper, which is out next week. And a couple of them said, there's a general sense of, people being cross about the transport and how expensive it's going to be and how everything's going to be so densely populated and people going on strike. But actually, she said, as a journalist, I can't think of a more interesting time to be in the city. It's once in a lifetime, really, that a city hosts Olympic Games. A lot has been done in preparation, and actually a lot will contribute to the legacy of Paris after this has happened. Not just in terms of, the buildings, but also, fashion houses who are preparing for, increasing their capacity with sportswear, and restaurants which are figuring out how they can better deal with a densely populated capital. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see post-Olympics how it changes the general sort of sense of the city.
And Fernando, it's also good having you here because you come from a country which does have reasonably recent experience of hosting an Olympic Games. Was it the same thing in Rio? Did everybody whinge about it for months before it actually happened and then actually quite enjoy it once it was up and running?
Yes, as in many cities. But I think, of course, there's been a lot of criticism in Rio because we hosted the World Cup as well 2 years before. I mean, there were a lot of spending. They had to build a lot of things in Rio, perhaps even more than Paris, because I think Paris, they're trying to be a bit more sustainable. But I love those big events. I mean, I think in the end, Brazilians did enjoy, and I think Parisians will do so. I mean, they're a very critical bunch, I have to say. That's undeniably true. But I'll be there. I'll be there at the closing ceremony. I cannot wait. And by the way, we're talking about love affair with France. Can I actually share something that I'm doing this evening?
And please. Well, I get the impression that we scarcely get a say in the matter, Fernando. Go right ahead.
I'll be drinking a glass of red wine and watching a film called Under Paris. It was on my list. It's about a shark on the run on the Seine River. It's a French film.
Well, it's not going to be on the run, is it? It'll be on the swim.
On the swim, exactly. And I've read some reviews. Some people are saying that could be the best shark movie since Jaws. I mean, they can do high culture and low culture as well.
Well, clearly, it'll be French red wine you're drinking, obviously.
Well, actually, it's Italian, but
Fernando,
I gotta be honest here.
Honestly, well, on that thought, before we move on to something nearer and dearer to Fernando's heart, even, I just want to ask you each in turn, Amy and Claudia. Amy, you first. That's a France recommendation from Fernando, and frankly inexplicable sounding film about a shark, which you watch while drinking Italian wine. What's a thing about Paris in particular, or France in general, that you would recommend to people?
Ooh, I love like the great bookshops and cafes, and they're everywhere. And I love when a bookshop is also a cafe. And I loved going to Monocle Jacob. It's a really great place. And I just think that just a really great like literary vibe in Paris, and a lot of really interesting conversations are happening, and you'll find a lot of those conversations in these great cafes. So.
Claudia, do you have a France, specifically, ideally Paris recommendation?
This is going to sound potentially cliched, but
Go on.
Baudelaire came up with this term in the 19th century called the flâneur, and the only way I can translate that sort of as best I can is to walk without a purpose. And it sounds so silly because it's like, how can you walk without a purpose? Everyone has a purpose these days, but in Paris there's something special about the city, which means that you actually can walk around and not necessarily have an aim of where you're going to end up. And I think that is probably the one recommendation that I would always say to people is, you don't need to get on the metro, you don't need to necessarily plan out your day from 9 a.m. until, the evening. Just walk around, see what you can find, and observe the beautiful architecture around you.
Genuinely, I completely agree with you. I do think Paris is one of the world's great strolling about cities.
It really is.
But we will continue with what appears to be an emerging theme of widespread angst about access to public facilities. In Brazil, consideration is being given to a proposal which would, or so its seething critics claim, permit the actual or effective privatisation of Brazil's beaches. The new legislation is a pet project of Senator Flavio Bolsonaro, son of the obvious, who cherishes ambitions of developing stretches of Brazil's shoreline into a rival to such gaudy Mexican resorts as Cancun and Acapulco. Fernando, are you among those seething critics?
Oh, yes. I mean...
Then seethe, Fernando. Seethe.
This is shocking because the Congress in 2022 voted for that area to be privatized. But the law is not yet in. I mean, it's a very long process. The Senate needs to discuss it, and Government Lula and his cabinet ministers are against it. But I have a feeling if the Congress would vote for it again, it would probably be allowed to. The thing is, of course, business people, they're very interested in that because, then they can build those mega resorts. Probably there will be less environmental protections because, like it or not, Brazil has many problems. But I would say our coast is fairly protected. Even if you are in Rio, we don't have that many kind of bars inside the beach. It's very, there's some little bars here and there. But, the beach is for everyone. People say that it's the only place where rich and poor meets in Brazil. I know it's a bit of a idealistic cliche, but it is true. It's a very unequal country. But we like to say that even if you're the owner of a private island, if somebody manages to arrive there, you can enjoy the beach. It doesn't matter if a billionaire owns the island, you are allowed to do that. So it is a little bit worrying, actually, in my opinion, if this plan really goes through.
All that being said, and you spoke very eloquently there about the importance of the equality of beaches to Brazilian people. Is this measure popular? Are people not massively up in arms about it?
Well, they are up in arms. And this week, there's been a big spat between two Brazilian celebrities. One is Neymar. I mean, he's in favor, of course. Sorry, I'm not a big fan of Neymar. So
but who is?
Who is, right? And Luana Piovani, which is an actress, and she was completely against. So a lot of celebrities came out. So there's been a lot of discussion. And I think if you ask Brazilians in the streets, the majority would be against it. But, I'm not sure if they will have a say. But let's see. I mean, everybody's talking about it. But the Senate opened a consultation with the public. I don't know exactly what that involves. And just so you know, just for some context, the area they're talking about, it's a very specific thing. It's a 33-meter strip of land at the highest point the tide reaches. So as soon as the tide is there, then you think 33 meters ahead. So, a lot of people live in this area. And at the moment, if you live in this area, you pay a specific fee to the government. So if the law is approved, maybe you can buy the land from the government. But then it's going to be yours, and you can do whatever you want. You can build like a huge tower block or whatever. So it is quite a complex idea. The Flávio Bolsonaro said, well, this will not affect the beach itself. It would still be open to the public, but I very much doubt so. There are a lot of question marks about this law if it is approved.
I mean, I hope Rishi Sunak's paying attention to this story, because this sounds like it could make his list of other brilliant vote-winning ideas. I will sell off all your beaches to property developers.
Oh, God.
Again, we have 4 weeks to go. I don't think anything is beyond him. Amy, this does seem like fairly basic stuff, doesn't it? Certainly the country I come from, Australia, has done historically a pretty good job of keeping its beaches entirely accessible to anybody who wants access to the beach. And in fact, even on the foreshores of Sydney Harbour, if you go pottering around a bit, you can sometimes find a beach with nobody else on it. I mean, this seems like there's almost no way you can sell this to a voting public.
No, I can't imagine how that would happen. And also, I lived in Australia, and I remember just everyone's life took place on the beach. And also, when you have someone who lives, even if the beach is still open to the public, if you have someone who lives next to it, they're going to find a way to privatize that section of beach. So, yeah, I can't imagine anyone would really go for that. But I don't know.
I mean, Claudia, just as a final thought and as a general rule, is it something the government should be very careful about, the idea of allowing public land to become privatised? Because it's usually one-way traffic, that, isn't it? I mean, once these beaches are lost to Brazil, they're not going to be coming back.
No, exactly. And, we talk here at Monocle a lot about sort of green spaces and urban waterways and, places that we can, come together and have a better quality of life. And I think beaches definitely come into that. They're a natural space, and there's something that, people, where people come together. And, it seems a crazy idea to have to, infringe upon that.
And if I may say, I don't want a Brazilian Cancun. I'm very happy without one. So I don't need it. It's a bit tacky.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, Amy Vandenberg and Claudia Jacobs, thank you for joining us. And finally, on today's show, our weekly letter from is a letter from Delphi in Greece. Monocle's Chris Chermak reports on the claustrophobic feeling, I got there eventually, of being stuck among tourists visiting the Oracle, that's the Delphic Oracle, not Chris, and leaving the rest of this rather idyllic Greek location untouched.
So this is going to be a letter about the ancient Greek city of Delphi, but it's also going to be a letter about the marvels of the fly-by tourist. You know who you are, the ones who flits in and out of sites with barely a moment to take them in and actually get to know the local culture. Like the time I went to Playa del Carmen in Mexico, was shocked by the strip of hotels and restaurants that only took dollars and catered to Americans. But equally shocked that I only had to go about a half kilometer down the road to find an idyllic hotel on the beach with hardly any Americans at all. Delphi, it turns out, is not so different. The town itself is small and somewhat run down, but its location is absolutely spectacular. Overlooking a valley that leads down to the Gulf of Corinth, something I could have spent hours trekking through had I not been paid to be there by Monocle to attend the Delphi Economic Forum. I'll be back for the real hiking experience soon. In the meantime, even amidst the conferencing, we were able to enjoy a series of epic dinners at surprisingly quiet restaurants directly overlooking said valley. The weather was absolutely perfect, blue skies all the time, even in April. But given that most people seem to only want to travel in the squalid summer, Delphi was an oddly quiet town. This, of course, is how I personally like my travel experiences, away from the high season of tourism and experiencing something of the local everyday culture. It's how I think all tourists should want to experience a new country. And yet I'm frequently still surprised by how many of my fellow tourists disagree and want the well-catered resort experience instead. Which brings us to the ancient town of Delphi, the most famous oracle that's just a short walk from the city of Delphi and that you have to climb a little hill to get to. I wandered over on a late Saturday morning after my final interviews at the forum were over, once again a quiet stroll through the Delphi city streets, only to discover to my horror that this was indeed where all the tourists were gathering. I swear it's like they'd magically appeared out of thin air, ignoring the city of Delphi itself, and just there for the old town and the oracle. Which of course is exactly the case. The capital Athens puts on bus tours that drive you the 2 hours to Delphi, stop at the oracle, give you a walking tour, with a loud obnoxious guide, standing next to another loud obnoxious guide, with their own tour group, standing next to another obnoxious guide who's blocking my own path up the hill to see the ruins themselves.
Everybody?
And then head back to Athens, or maybe, if you're lucky, stop for a quick walk in the nearby town of Arakova, just below Mount Parnassus. It's the kind of whistle-stop tourist site tour that I really cannot stand. And I've rarely had the kind of tourist claustrophobia that I experienced spending about half an hour walking among the Delphi Oracle ruins, made all the worse by the fact that everywhere else in Delphi was so quiet. So, if that was you taking pictures and blocking my path up to the Delphi ruins last month, hurrying around before catching the bus back to the capital Athens, might I suggest that next time you actually book a visit to Delphi itself, use it as a base, tour the area, see more than just the main tourist site, pay the locals, frequent their hotels. Greek towns outside of the islands and Athens and tourist hotspots could certainly use the money. And the scenery is just breathtaking. Please, though, don't come all at once. I'll let you know when I'm booking my next Delphi visit so you can all stay away and leave me with my peace and tranquility. For Monocle in Delphi, I'm Chris Chermak.
Thank you, Chris. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Carlotta Rebello, Chris Chermak, Claudia Jacobs, Amy Vandenberg and Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Mullett here in London. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday. Thanks for listening and have a great weekend.